and welcome. Thank you for joining us at this panel. My name is Courtney Radsch with the UCLA Institute for Technology, Law, and Policy. And we're delighted to have you here today to talk about news media bargaining codes. And we're going to kick it off first. Some of you may be wondering, what is a news media bargaining code and why do we have a whole session on it at the International Journalism Festival? We're going to kick it off with Anya Schiffrin, who is one of the world's foremost experts on this topic, to give us a sense of what are we talking about so that as we delve into the specifics about what's happening around the world, we're all starting from the same starting point. So Anya, what are we talking about? Why do news media bargaining codes matter? Tell us what happened in Australia to put this on the agenda.
Sure, thank you very much. Can everyone hear me? I know there's an echo. First of all, thanks everybody for coming. The five of us are pretty obsessed with bargaining codes, and I didn't know that on such a beautiful day so many people would come to join us. So thank you all for being here. The News Media Bargaining Code, in a nutshell, passed in spring of 2021. So it was being planned during the pandemic and didn't probably get as much attention as you would have expected. And what was so key about it was Australia was one of the first countries to basically successfully get Google and Facebook to pay for news. And they did this because of a few things. One was they used competition law instead of copyright law. And the idea of the code was to even up the imbalance between the large tech companies and the media outlets. And the idea is that Google and Facebook can negotiate with the outlets to decide how much money to pay them. And if they can't reach an agreement, the government will come in and mediate the bargaining. And so what this was a very powerful nudge, which ended up releasing Google and Facebook pretty much 200 million Australian dollars a year into supporting journalism. There's been tons and tons of criticism, which we're going to get into, about the lack of transparency, the lack of obligations around the code, and the divisions between large and small outlets. When you design policy, incumbents benefit, and so the Murdoch-owned press got most of the money. But I think a lot of us felt that this was an exciting way to look at getting funds to journalism. Not perfect, won't last forever, may just be a few years, but it was something worth considering. And I think why we're here today is because so many other countries now are looking at their own versions of the code. So this will be a very up-to-date panel where you're going to hear the latest from Australia and then Canada, Brazil, and the UK. So I'll stop now.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously we all know there's this huge power imbalance, and so we've finally seen regulators step up to the plate, and Australia was the first country to actually put it into law. And I think a lot of us know that Facebook turned off the news in Australia right as the COVID vaccine was being rolled out in retaliation, trying to prevent the code from passing, but nonetheless it has, and now it's been in place. And I want to hear from Andrea Carson, professor at political communication at Trobe University, to tell us a little bit about, what exactly did Australia do, and what have you learned since this law has been in effect, and now you're seeing it being replicated around the world?
Thank you, Courtney, and as you can tell from my accent, I'm from Australia. This was world first legislation that was passed in 2021 after a 2-year review where the government, concerned about, as many people here would have experienced in their own countries, successive job losses, waves of cost cutting that's been going on probably for the last 15 years or more, and was exacerbated by the pandemic, but also the global financial crisis. There was a real question here about whether newsrooms were going to be sustainable. So the Australian Competition Commission was ordered to do a 2-year study that was very wide-ranging in its terms of reference, which included looking at the power imbalances with attracting advertising and doing business. And the reason it was so novel was because, unlike what had happened in Europe, where the idea of getting money from the big tech companies had been done through copyright law, this was done through competition law. It was passed by a Conservative government. We've since changed government, and there's an interesting space there that we can talk about in a moment. And as Anya said, 200 million, which is 125 million euros, has flowed to the major businesses. The only other thing I'd say at this point is the backdrop to the Australian media is it's very concentrated in ownership. There's really only 2 large companies and there's not a lot of pluralism. We only have 12 daily newspapers across the country and they're basically split between 2 major companies.
And just in terms of the beneficiaries, I mean, most media have gotten deals with at least Google as well as Facebook, including one of the public broadcasters, correct?
So the legislation only names Facebook and Google at this point in time. Google has been more generous, it would appear, with the deals. It's done over 20. Facebook's done about 14, and we can get into the strategic reasons behind that as we go on. But the reason I'm saying about is because all of this is commercial in confidence. We don't know exactly how many deals have been done. We don't know exactly how much money's flowed. From those who've been prepared to talk and from gathering newspaper articles and so forth, we think it's about 200 million Australian that's flowed and that more deals have been done by Google rather than Facebook or Meta.
Great. Now, Patricia Mello Campos is a journalist with Folha de São Paulo. Hopefully I didn't butcher that too much. Brazil has reintroduced a type of news media bargaining code as part of a much larger legislative package, often referred to as the fake news bill, which didn't pass last year, we understand, in part because of divisions that maybe Google and Facebook helped inculcate among the media community. Tell us what is happening in Brazil next week, I guess. What are we going to see?
Yes, Courtney. That's too loud, sorry. The Speaker of the House announced that he's going to vote, he's going to put out to vote the so-called fake news bill next week. And what changed from last year? Last year there was a sort of an alliance, unspoken alliance between the platforms and the Bolsonaro government, who were basically against the regulation. What we are seeing in the current bill is we have both something very similar to the Australian bargaining code in terms of sustainability for journalism, and on the other hand, a change in the responsibility regime for the platforms, basically changing our section 230, which is called Marco Civil da Internet. And what really changed that made, I mean, there's a wide expectation that it's going to pass the House next week and then it's going to go on to the Senate, is because Brazil has been through, let's say, perfect storm. We had attacks, like anti-democratic attacks on January 8th. That was, with the help of organization through social media, and social media platforms were not that helpful. And also there's been a series of school shootings and stabbings, also sort of fueled by social media. And some of the platforms like Twitter have been unwilling to help curb that kind of inflammatory speech. So yes, so next week.
Okay, so you mentioned Section 230, which is essentially a provision of US law, but you see this in other laws, which protects platforms from intermediary liability for the content they host on their platforms. So this would change that dynamic. But it would also give media the right to collectively bargain with the platforms. Is that kind of what it's boiling down to?
Yes, it follows the Australian bargaining code in terms of you can collectively or individually bargain, negotiate with the platforms, and if they don't reach a deal, then there's arbitration. There are no transparency measures, also just like Australia, just like you mentioned, we don't know, I mean, it's not mandatory that you have to, publish or have the values or what you're going to do with the money. There's no transparency clauses.
Okay, so no transparency mandate. All right, so Phaedra de Saint Rome from McGill University Center for Media Technology and Democracy in Canada. Canada also is quite far along in the legislative process with a more precise bill focused on a news media bargaining code, C-118. Tell us what is happening there, what's the latest, and what do you expect? Who are the beneficiaries? Is there transparency requirements? What have you learned also from Australia?
Yeah, so thanks, Courtney. So maybe just to build off a little bit of, what has been said, There are indeed a lot of similarities with the Canadian model as with the Australian model, but I think there are a bunch of key differences as well, one being the transparency component, but also maybe just to contextualize it within broader legislation that the Canadian government has been working on. Already in 2019, the Canadian government introduced a series of measures targeting our journalism industry aimed at propping it up. So everything from creating a new charitable status for journalism organizations to creating a Canadian journalism labor tax credit, for example. And so this C-18 or Online News Act is kind of part of this broader package of legislation that the government's rolling out. In terms of where we're at with it now, our hope is that it passes before the House rises in June. So it's currently in the Senate. It's past the House stage. And, you know, again, in terms of differences, I think from the Australian model, because this is the one that we all have kind of at the front of our minds, is that on the one hand, so we didn't go the route of deciding to house this under our competition bureau. So instead, it's housed within a regulatory body, the Canadian Radio Telecommunications Commission, or the CRTC. And part of, you know, I think the thinking with that was that housing it in a regulatory body as opposed to a competition bureau gives you more regulatory levers to play with rather than just competition law. And so that's where the transparency component comes in. One of the key, in fact, the key policy lever in our Online News Act is the exemption criteria, and this is really where this transparency component comes in. And so platforms can be exempted from being designated for arbitration, but only if they report the details of their deals, and these all meet a set of criteria, including, you know, these deals need to provide for fair compensation to news businesses. They need to ensure that an appropriate portion of the compensation is used by news businesses to support production of local, regional, and national news, so not just going to executive bonuses at the end of the year. It needs to contribute to sustainability of the Canadian news marketplace, contribute to the creation of diverse news in Canada and supporting diverse voices in our Canadian news marketplace. So I think in terms of who the beneficiaries have been, it really does a lot for independent journalism because not only is it a collective bargaining framework where, you know, individual organizations can come together come either individually or in groups to collectively bargain, but it also creates this additional level of transparency to these deals. And so having that information when going into the bargaining room is a huge plus.
Great, thank you for that really helpful description. So it sounds like there's a little bit of a transparency carrot. In other words, you know, it's not mandatory, but if you do it, you get this extra benefit. Okay, Jonathan Heawood, you are the Executive Director of the Public Interest News Foundation and focused on the UK law, which is, again, part of a much broader legislative package, housed in the Competition Authority. What is the UK doing with respect to news media bargaining codes?
Yeah, so the UK, as you all know, is a pretty weird country. You know, we sit somewhere between Europe and America, and we do things in our own inimitable way. So we've been talking, legislators have been talking for several years now in the UK about the need to do two things. One is to make big tech platforms much more accountable, and the other is to think about how we sustain journalism. I think legislators like to believe that a bargaining code approach does both of those things in one amazing, beautiful way. My worry is it does each of them a bit, and we need a lot of other things to happen at the same time. But there is political will to act. So in this country, in the UK, we have forthcoming legislation called the Digital Markets, Competition and Consumers Bill, which, as you say, Courtney, will be very big. So it won't just do this news media bargaining element. It will designate the very biggest platforms which are active in the UK, those which have what they call strategic market status. In other words, those which have become monopolistic in one or other area of the economy. They will be designated in potentially not just, so it won't just be Meta and Alphabet that will be designated. It might be Google Search is designated for its monopoly status over the search end of the economy, but then maybe Google News Showcase is also separately designated for its monopoly over aggregation, or Apple News is designated, etc. So there could be a kind of complicated jigsaw of designated platforms, and then they will then be regulated by an entirely new regulator, the Digital Markets Unit, that will look at their impact on all these different areas of the economy, that will have, in theory, if the legislators follow through with the big talk, will have really big powers. Powers to investigate, to lift the lid, to look at the data, look at the algorithms, find out what's going on, find out where the money is flowing, to fine if there are breaches of the regulations or the laws, and potentially even to break up or to block, certainly to block mergers and acquisitions, but at worst, but most serious, actually to break up elements. Particularly, I think the area where the regulator is going to be very, very interested in looking at breaking up is around the integration of the advertising, the digital advertising value chain, where Google in particular have just sewn that up. So big new regulator, big powers, big talk, news media bargaining code, very small part of that, but an important part of it because our big publishers, including Mr. Murdoch, are pushing very hard for that. So obviously our concern, we care about the quality of journalism, not just big publishers. We want to see small publishers able to benefit from the new regulation. And we want the outcome of this to be actually an improved quality and quantity of journalism, not just money flowing from one very big company to another very big company. To us, that doesn't look like a particularly wonderful outcome of public policy. We want a more plural media environment in the UK. We also would like to see a more plural platform environment. It's not healthy for the economy. We have a growing tech sector in the UK. We have homegrown platforms and aggregators. The right regulation can actually open things up for them by creating more competitive environment. So the government has promised legislation. We haven't yet seen the detail. It is promised this year, between now and October. Fingers crossed it does what we want it to do.
And does it also give the media the right to collectively bargain?
So we believe it will, but again, we don't know until we've seen the letter. What we're hoping is it will certainly give smaller media the right to collectively bargain, because there's a stronger argument there. For big media to collectively bargain is more complex, but for small media, it's almost in the platform's interests as well to have a single point of contact and to have 400 small independents.
And can I just point out, that's what happened in Australia about a year afterwards, was the smaller outlets got together and collectively negotiated. I mean, Andrea will correct me if I'm wrong, but it brought those smaller outlets in that everybody had been so worried about.
Right, so I just also want to, the US has the Journalist Conservation and Preservation Act, which is its version of the News Media Bargaining Code, and California has introduced legislation for the Journalism Preservation Act. And similar to the Australian and Canadian approaches, it would essentially mandate that companies pay publishers a journalism usage fee. This is in the California version, each time that they sell local news content and sell advertising alongside it. And it would require publishers to invest 70% of that back into journalism. The Journalism Conservation Act doesn't have as much detail there, but it similarly would mandate a revenue sharing model and alleviate some of the restrictions on collective bargaining. So we're seeing, a lot of similarities, although a bit of difference in terms of what parts of the government are doing this. But, Anya, one of the issues that is, I think, at the heart of this is questions about media capture. How do you prevent political influence into determining the winners and the losers? And how do we ensure that these types of regulations benefit, as John said, a wide variety of media and not just the big players? So talk a little bit about what you're seeing in terms of the approaches with media capture.
Yeah, I think one of the fears is that it's going to further exacerbate this unhealthy dependence that media outlets have on big tech, and that getting money from them is really a recipe for disaster. And I guess I have a few responses to that. One is that many organizations are already getting tons and tons of money from big tech without any transparency about that. I'm thinking of some of the work that Open Markets has done on the New York Times. So I think the problem is already there. I think it's really important for regulators to mandate transparency, and I would want to see in later iterations of this law rules about the fact that you have to spend the money on creating more news and you have to disclose. So I think those are things that could be regulated, but I'm also assuming that this won't last for very long. This to me is like a temporary measure. We're already seeing, right, Google and Facebook saying that, well, they don't want news, they want to get out of news. So I view this as kind of a bridge thing, but I'm not necessarily, I don't think it'll be long term.
And in terms of Australia's experience, right, there was this criticism about, the beneficiaries, Murdoch being the beneficiary. You mentioned there isn't a lot of pluralism, but we've also seen reporting that this has led to a renaissance in journalism jobs hiring. Were there requirements in the bargaining code related to spending on journalism?
So that's a great question, and we're a little further down the track than the others. Right. And it's interesting to hear the other case experiences, the other countries that have looked at the Australian example and improved upon it. So two criticisms that are common for the Australian one is that there's no requirement that any of the money flowing from big tech into the media organisations actually gets spent on journalism. Now that's somewhat problematic because when the ministers of communication and the treasurer were announcing that they had got this world-breaking legislation through, they would put that in the context of we want better public interest journalism. And yet there's no provision that it has to be spent on that. In fact, News Corp, we've already mentioned Rupert Murdoch, continue to cut workplaces and to convert mastheads to online only, even after some of this revenue was coming in. The second component is obviously that transparency part. It's good to hear that some of the other countries have learnt from that. But the other thing I would say is that we don't also want perfection to be the enemy of the good, that there are some good things coming from this. Some media, not all media outlets are the same. Some have taken this money in very good faith. They have poured it back into journalism. A great example of that is The Guardian. It has added another 50 journalistic roles to its newsrooms. And we are a little further down the track. We've done a 12-month review, and so we get some, as academics and journalists, we get some insights into how media organisations are viewing this news media bargaining code. Those that are grumpiest are probably the smaller outlets. Yes, they do have the power to collectively bargain. However, the code has never been designated in Australia. That remains the sole power of the Treasurer. And there's not the appetite to do that. And one of the things that Australia has taken from the United States is a thing called final offer bargaining, which means that if it is designated, Meta could put in a bid that they're prepared to commit $2. The news company might say it's worth 50 million. There's going to be one winner, one loser. There's no room under this legislation for a midway point or negotiation. It's one or the other. And that forced arbitration hasn't occurred because the code has not been designated.
Now,
can I just make one point?
Sure.
I mean, I think the forced the final offer, and every time I write about it, my editor cuts it out, but I think it's really important to understand the whole idea was to force the two sides to come together quickly so that you wouldn't have Google dragging out negotiations with some teeny outlet for several years. So I think that was one of the good things about the
Except it hasn't been activated, so it's a theory at the moment.
it's a threat more so than having been put into practice. So now in Canada, we heard a lot about the specifics, but to what extent are you concerned about the fact, according to your colleague Taylor Owen, that 50% of media budgets are going to be covered by either government or platform funding? What does that do to, the independence of the media?
I mean, it's definitely a concern, and I think it goes back to Anya Schiffrin's point about media capture. But again, I think this Online News Act needs to be considered as part of a broader package, a broader suite of policies. Again, the status quo. Like, we're living in a world where this money is already going from big tech platforms to...
Okay, but I mean, isn't there a legitimate question about the arguably the two most powerful institutions that journalists need to be covering, government and platforms, are now providing a very substantial portion of the funding. So how, if at all, are the media concerned about that? Do they think they can still do their jobs? What does the public think about that?
I mean, I think, so it's kind of, there's definitely divides, both among news publishers and among the public. The first thing I would say is just to go back to this transparency component. I think it is so important that the terms of these deals have to be reported on. I think if there's one improvement that can be made, it's to make this reporting happen more regularly. Right now it's only annually. So to make that happen more regularly would be great. Another thing too is that, whereas a lot of the divisions and kind of lines that we're seeing around the concerns are ones that we know are also coming from platforms themselves. And so going back to, I think, a conversation we were having earlier about, the role that these tech platforms are playing in our debate, the notion that, this represents a link tax, or this is going to, quote unquote, break the internet. Those are the terms of the concerns that we're typically hearing, and neither of those are the case. And so again, I think the transparency component is great. And just to go back, I think there was a question on how this policy can be arm's length, or how government can be arm's length from the funding as well. That's why the bill is structured the way it is around collective bargaining, and why they decided to go that route as opposed to creating a fund. A fund, is a lot more, is essentially facilitating like that money kind of directively versus, the Online News Act. It's more about creating the framework for collective bargaining.
Great, thank you. I mean, I think, when you come to Brazil, especially under the previous government, where there were so many issues with media capture and media independence and disinformation, et cetera, there was a lot of division in the news media over whether that was the right approach. Patricia, are you seeing that division is still there? And to what extent are you're a journalist, you work for a major news outlet, are you concerned about the idea of the government getting into the business of deciding who benefits, and what are the terms, who is setting the terms of who can be a beneficiary under this?
Great question. Well, there's two things. I mean, there's a division between the big media outlets and the independent media outlets. And one of the things, just like in Australia and I think in Canada, of course, the mainstream media favors the bargaining code, whereas the independent media, most of them would like to have a fund that would be managed by an independent entity, not linked to the government, but with government representatives. But we know that in the end, it's always going to be, it's going to have a bias depending on what government is in place. It's hard to say if a government is not going to appoint, let's say, representatives of civil society that are more aligned to the current government, right? So this was a discussion, and one of the things, talking about capture, the platform's finance fund, most of the independent media outlets and many of the think tanks and many of the journalism organizations. So basically, when we are having this discussion in public, you have large media outlets on one side and big platforms through proxies on the other side. I guess it would be ideal if you could combine bargaining code and a fund that had specific provisions for public interest media. But then again, how do you define this? Which is very hard. As it is now, the text of the bill that's going to be voted next week only, it's less, it has fewer details than the Australia and the Canada legislation, in terms that it only says that it needs to be an outlet that has been in existence for 2 years before the enactment of the law, and has to do professional journalism. But we know that all those terms are very vague. And the other thing that is concerning in the Brazilian legislation, they only mention a regulatory entity to be constituted. So we don't know who's going to be the regulator for all that, which is, I mean, it's very hard to think about anything without a regulator.
And does it require that any funds be spent on journalism or provide any guidance? No. Okay.
That's the thing. Yeah, as it is now, it has no requirements whatsoever. It's just, okay, so you can bargain collectively, but it doesn't say you need transparency, you need to spend the funds in, you know, hiring journalists or investing in journalism, nothing of that.
So it's similar in the United States, and that's one of the division points as well, is should it be required to be spent on journalism? And how do you define that? Is it a reporter? Does it include the editors? Does it include the admin people who process their healthcare and paychecks, right? So that's a question. How is the UK, if at all, considering the requirements on where to spend any funding?
Yeah, not at all. This has not yet been looked at. I mean, I think it comes back to that point I made, that we're trying to do two big different things here. We're talking about platform accountability, and we're talking about journalism sustainability. And on a really good day, you get into the sweet spot where you get both. On a bad day, you end up with neither, or a kind of bit of both, but it's not really the best version of either. So I mean, the way I look at the bill that's coming forward in the UK is it's about a minimum fair economic transaction. Where you have a dominant platform and news publishers feel obliged, they really have no option but to share their content or allow their content to be shared on that platform, whether it's a search, a social, or an aggregator. And the platform is harvesting the vast majority of economic value from that transaction. Let's lift the lid, find out, actually, is that fair? Is the platform abusing its monopolistic position? Is it imposing unfair terms on the publisher? And let's use the regulator to intervene and make sure that the terms are fair. Now, the sad truth is that may mean big publishers benefit more. Big publishers generate more traffic. They use clickbait to generate traffic.
Why do you say, so this is what I don't understand in some of these debates, is why do we say it's a shame that big publishers are going to benefit? Because on the one hand, big publishers are the ones who are doing multi-year investigation, deep digs, massive data analysis. It seems like there's this inherent sense that, like, oh gosh, it's only going to be the big publishers, when there have been these efforts to make sure it's broader than that.
Yeah, so
I feel like that's a Google talking point.
Okay, let me just have John, and then I'll come.
I mean, there is this weird thing where, like, a stopped clock tells the right time twice a day, and sometimes Google talking points are on the money.
Okay.
So I do think there is a risk there. So in the UK, Rupert Murdoch owns the Sunday Times, which is one of our best newspapers, and publishes fantastic multi-year investigations. And if they are in some way being treated unfairly by the platforms, they should be treated fairly. I mean, you're quite right. It's not an either or. But the danger is, as in Australia, we also do have a very concentrated media market. It's very hard for small independent players to break in. If what comes out of this is an incumbency bias, where big players, simply because they're already big, get bigger, regardless of the quality of their journalism, then that's not the best place to be in.
Okay,
Can I just add something? I mean, it is a concern in Brazil as well, because of course you need to have a way to measure this, and traffic is audience is being the only way to measure this. So you're not necessarily going to reward quality journalism or public interest journalism. I know it's hard to define, but still, you might end up financing big media outlets that are, increasing the number of celebrity journalists, all respect to celebrity journalists. But anyway, right? I mean, if it's the only, if there are no other criteria, it could generate some distortion.
Phaedra?
If I could just add, the way the Canadian Online News Act sought to address that is they actually recently added an amendment that sets out that one of the exemption criteria is that the news publisher has to follow, a set of journalistic standards in order to qualify. So I think that's one thing. And I just want to get back to this division as well, because I think a lot of the way the picture's been painted is that it's, big news publishers versus small ones. But in Canada, at least, and I think is testament to just the muddying of the waters that has taken place largely by platforms like Meta and Google, is that we don't see that division kind of big against small. Like, there are actors on either side of that divide that are either for the News Act, against it, for a fund, against it, don't want anything done at all, so.
So Anya, you...
Well, no, I think I was just going to come in and support our esteemed moderator and say I agree with you. Small outlets are important, but if they're going to get something, I don't know. I mean, isn't it just as market distorting to say you're tiny, you have no traffic, and you're going to get most of the money? Like, I don't see how that's a sort of morally superior position either.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Andrea?
Some of the deals that have been done in Australia have been very arbitrary. So I said earlier that Google has done more than what Meta has. Meta made, it would seem, some sort of calculation that it had done enough that it was going to avoid designation, which meant that our second public broadcaster, the SBS, which has a special charter to look after the arts and for those that speak languages other than English, missed out on getting any funding from Meta, as did The Conversation, which many of you may be familiar with, which started in Australia. It's now in 9 countries, which is a public interest journalism academic digest, was also unable to engage Meta in making a deal. And this is problematic because there's a thing in some of the deals which has been labelled a poison pill, and that is that the outlets that have managed to get deals have a clause that if the Meta or Google are designated, their deals become void and they lose the money that they've already got. So in terms of this division between media outlets, you're now seeing a silencing of the debate from the companies that have benefited from the News Media Bargaining Code because they don't want this poison pill provision to be activated.
And that was added by the platforms. Obviously, there are no constraints on types of provisions that can be put in.
And again, this speaks to the power imbalance. So you might remember that Facebook threatened to take news off its platforms. It did do that for about 9 days. It had a very broad definition of what news was, and that included emergency services. And this was happening when Australia was having horrific bushfires. So local communities weren't able to get information, healthcare information, emergency service information. What did that do? It created a public backlash, but it also did some last-minute amendments to the bill that were in favour of the platforms. It consolidated the power in the Treasurer for this designation, and it also changed some of the notification periods for when the platforms altered their algorithm. It shortened how much notice they had to give to the media outlets.
Can I just ask something about the Australian in the case of The Conversation specifically, that Meta refused to negotiate with them, isn't that what the arbitration is for? I mean, how hard is it to get Meta designated or force them to negotiate?
The Treasurer needs to designate, and we've had a change of government since then. There's high inflation, cost of living pressures. The new government has so many other issues it's dealing with that I don't think revisiting the News Media Bargaining Code is going to be a first order issue for a government that's only not even 12 months in. So how much power do outlets have to force that designation and to get Meta to the table? At this point in time, not much.
I think it would have, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think when the Treasury review came out would have been the time, and they decided not to. I just want to say a couple more things before questions.
Sure.
Okay, one is we just had a panel on the bargaining code at Columbia a couple weeks ago, and Indonesia is about to issue a presidential decree that would do something like that. I'm not sure how much they're going to bundle it with other measures that may perhaps be a little bit less friendly to free expression, but I did want to flag that Indonesia is next, or maybe next, and also that it's coming up a little bit in South Africa Africa, and I think they've just opened a digital inquiry. And we understand from our friends in South Africa that Google is already preemptively trying to hand out money. Before questions, could Jonathan mention the Columbia Principles?
What are the Columbia Principles, John?
It's a very leading question. So yeah, last year when some of us were at Columbia, hosted by Anya, to talk about this issue, we got together and we said, okay, so we're all in different countries, we're very small, we're academics, activists, journalists, we're up against some of the world's biggest, most powerful companies and governments, and there's all sorts of ways in which these mechanisms, these codes, could go right or could go wrong. So in Indonesia, the fear is that a pretty autocratic government will use this new regulatory arrangement to crack down on press freedom. And there are other countries where maybe you end up with the platforms actually enshrining their power or the dominant publishers. So we said, okay, well, what are the outcomes that we want to see? What are the core principles that we think these new regulations should enshrine? And we've begun work on that. We're hoping to launch them shortly. Anyone who's interested, come and talk to us afterwards. But the idea is that we set some 9 or 10 high-level principles around so the outcome should be greater media plurality. It should be greater diversity in the media. It should be a more sustainable media. It should be more competitive platform economy. The public interest journalism should come out before the celebrity journalism and the clickbait. These are all the desirables that we want to see. And it's a way then of using that framework to assess these mechanisms in different countries and maybe even score them and say, look, it's doing well here, but it's failing here. And although we're small, globally we can come together and coordinate and maybe have a bit more impact.
Great, thank you. I want to open it up to questions. Does anyone want to have a question for the panel? Raise your hand and we can bring you a mic. And did you want to just weigh in quickly, Phaedra? Did you have something to add?
I mean, I just had a point going back to this oft-repeated comment that, all the money is going to go to big publishers. At the end of the day, I think we have to remember just what the purpose of these bills are, and it's to rebalance asymmetry between news publishers and platforms. Right. It's not to address, the fact that there are small independent news publishers and big ones and those kind of unfairness.
Great. Let's go here to a question.
Yes, thank you for the great panel. My name is actually also Anya. I have 2 questions. My first question is, how in your respective countries do you actually evaluate the impact of the news bargaining codes, given that they are not transparent in all of them? So it makes it a bit difficult to look at numbers, at least. And then my second question is, now we've only been talking about news bargaining codes, which is the topic of this session, I guess, but how is this topic seen in your respective countries, like in a wider context about news media viability and, I guess, subsidization in general and funding of journalism?
So Andrea, why don't you go first since you actually have a process to review?
Yeah, I've got a fairly short answer to the first part of that question. It's almost impossible to gauge impact because it's not transparent. We've had a review, organisations have voluntarily submitted their grievances with the code. That's mainly what came out of the review. Some have been able to declare extra journalists that they've hired, but any sort of evidence-based systemic review of how the code's working and where it's maybe plugged some of those news desert holes or expanded regional journalism, which is in dire condition in Australia, it's very hard for us to do that while it lacks that transparency piece.
Just a quick question, Phaedra, in the Canadian legislation, is there any impact assessment required?
There's annual reporting that's done by the regulator, so by the commission. Right now it's annual. We think it should be quarterly. But one thing I think that's interesting in that context as well is that when the 2 parties are coming together to decide on what the value of their agreement should be, part of the act compels platforms to share their metrics with how they themselves are valuing this news.
Great. And Anya.
Just wanted to say that Australia is small enough that it's almost very personal, and artisanal. So Rod Sims, the competition commissioner, is keeping track of the money and is sharing that figure widely. Andrea says we can trust it. And Richard Dennis from the Australian Institute just sent us some numbers this morning on job creation. Somebody I was talking to this week pointed out that the code has become sort of a big part of Australia's soft power. People are going all over the world talking about it, explaining it to the rest of us.
It's our contagion effect on the rest of the world. You're welcome.
I know, well, thank you. I mean, the US, we certainly haven't been doing our job of stepping up to regulate the platforms, and I think it's interesting because we're the exact opposite in the US. So big, we couldn't name possibly every news organization that would benefit, et cetera. And I think that's one of the big challenges is how do you write in an impact assessment? Can you write that into legislation? I know the Journalist Conservation and Preservation Act might have some sort of, finite period of time at which point it will be reviewed, but it will be several years. John, Patricia, are there any thoughts on impact?
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the things we put in the Columbia Principles, is that you must have transparency. I really believe.
What does that mean?
So it means, for a start, that if a platform, so at the moment platforms come to us and say, news already benefits from our existence. News publishers get access to audiences because of search, because of social, because of the aggregation. And the idea that we should be paying them additional money is nonsense. But the answer to that is, well, show us. Just show us the workings. Maybe that's true. Maybe there is already a net benefit to publishers from the existence of platforms, but maybe there isn't. So that's one of the important things about transparency. And then the second important dimension is if there is a code and if deals are made under a code, then at least a regulator should be able to see the terms of those deals and make sure that they're consistent, that they're not discriminatory, that they're not favoring publishers who are scratching the back of the platforms or whatever. So there's no room for covert influence there.
Yeah, that balance between some level of transparency but recognizing their private trade deals. I have to say, I think the Digital Services Act actually represents the best opportunity to get under the hood, access some of the data to understand the relationship between traffic and revenue, because we really do not know that. So I hope that answers your question. We do need to wrap up, so final thoughts. John, we're gonna start with you. You mentioned the Columbia Principles. Can you tell people where do they find that, and how are you making sure the government of the UK sees those?
So, as I said, we haven't yet published the Columbia Principles. So come and talk to us if you want to contribute to them. They will go up on our website, publicinterestnews.org.uk, and we'll create a dedicated site in due course. I guess my final overarching thought is that, I would love to live in a world where we had really fantastic, vibrant platforms. I'd like there to be lots of platforms. I don't want to live in a world with two platforms that can define the terms for everyone else, and lots of fantastic publishers producing great journalism. They both bring fantastic things to the democratic public sphere. This should not be a win-lose game between those two industries. There should be a win-win.
Great. Patricia, are you advocating for the code to pass or not? What do you want to
I can't advocate for anything because I'm covering this, but I think whatever happens, something has to happen. I mean, we can't lose sight of what is at stake here. In many countries, including in Brazil, as it is, media outlets are not going to survive. It's not sustainable. They're not making money. It's not going to survive. And they can't be dependent on platforms arbitrarily and randomly handing out money. So there needs to be some sort of regulation. I'm not sure if the bargaining code is ideal or a fund or the digital copyright directive, but something has to be done, and I think there's momentum now to pass regulation.
Great. Phaedra, last thoughts from Canada.
I mean, just to reiterate, I think what Patricia said is that a free and vibrant press is what is common to all democracies around the world, no matter what their political realities are, no matter what context in which they try to put together this kind of legislation. So I think that's something we should all keep in mind.
Great. Andrea, when you guys did that consultation, everyone warned the link tax was going to break the internet. The internet still works. What can we learn from Australia? What do you want all of these countries to take away?
I'd say, returning to a point Anya made, watch this space. We're seeing Meta move into the metaverse, lots of rhetoric about moving out of news, more countries are taking this up. Australia is, and you pointed out, is a small country. It wasn't that threatening, but now that there is this contagion effect, I think you might see some pretty drastic things happening in the future where maybe the platforms do strip news off their platforms if they get the opportunity to do so.
Anya, final? Nope. All right. Well, I think, as Andrea said, watch this space. Indonesia, another model. Do we want a presidential decree with one press council deciding beneficiaries? Maybe this is something we need to look at. I think look at the U.S. It seems to me this is not going to hurt any worse than we're hurting already. So might as well give it a shot. Seems to be working in Australia. See what happens in Canada. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you to our audience. And we'll look forward to seeing the Columbia principles soon. Thanks.